Alright guys, let's talk about frame rates. Your frame rate is the number of still frames or images your camera takes per second. The combination of watching 24 different images stacked up back to back over 1 second is what gives the illusion of motion picture or video. Going to your camera, your frame rates can be found right next to your resolution size. So let's go ahead and click on that, and you'll see pops up a few options of different frame rates you can shoot in. Now on most DSLRs, you're going to have the options of 24, 30, or 60 frames per second. Now I personally always shoot my projects at 24 frames per second. And the reason for that is because most Hollywood feature films are shot at 24 frames per second. So that is what the human eye is used to seeing when it comes to cinematic films due to the amount of motion blur that 24 frames per second causes. Shooting at 30 frames per second or higher causes your video to appear smoother and clearer, like what you'd see in a soap opera or a news report. The video looks smoother because there is less motion blur, so it won't have the same cinematic look as a Hollywood film. Now because this video you are watching was exported at 24 frames per second, I cannot accurately demonstrate this difference in motion blur. So after this video I provided a sample of 24, 30, and 60 frame per second clips exported out individually so that you can clearly see the difference in motion blur and understand why I shoot all my projects at 24 frames per second. Now there is a time when I do shoot higher frame rates than 24, and that is when I shoot higher frames with the intentions of slowing them down afterwards in post down to 24 frames per second. So when I shoot a clip at 30 frames per second and then slow it down to 24 frames per second, this is essentially stretching out those 30 frames to play back at only 24 frames per second. This leaves 6 leftover frames, meaning it will take more time to play all 30 frames at 24 frames per second. So take a look at this clip shot at 24 frames, and then take a look at the same clip shot at 30 frames per second and then slowed down to 24 frames per second in post. As you can see, the second clip is just a little bit slowed down. When I convert 60 frames down to 24 frames per second, it stretches those frames out to fit only 24 of its frames in 1 second, leaving 36 leftover frames. This means it will take 2.5 seconds to play all 60 frames at 24 frames per second. And this is what causes slow motion. Some people make the mistake of shooting 24 frames per second and then trying to slow that footage down. Though you can do that, it won't give you true slow motion. It will make the footage look choppy because you're spreading out your 24 frames too thin, leaving too many gaps in between. In order to get real slow motion that looks smooth and clean, you need to shoot more frames per second and then convert that higher number of frames down to 24 frames per second. Now let me show you what will happen if you shoot higher frame rates and then decide later when you're editing the footage that you don't want to slow those clips down anymore. For example, if I shot a 30 frame per second clip and then stuck it in my 24 frame per second project without converting it or slowing it down, I am essentially telling my 30 frame per second clip to only play 24 of its 30 frames. So what it does is it cuts out 6 of its frames to match the 24 frame rate of the rest of the video. Here's a few examples of clips that have been shot at 30 frames per second and then played back at 24 frames per second without converting or slowing it down. As you can see, there are some jutters or choppy moments in the footage, and that's because of those gaps from those frames that you asked it to take out. Now if you bring in a higher frame rate like a 60 frame per second clip into a 24 frame per second timeline, this judder doesn't look quite as bad because the gaps caused by the removed frames aren't quite as wide as the gaps caused by a 30 frame per second clip converted down to 24 frame per second. In summary, I would recommend shooting at 24 frames per second, and the times when you're going to want to shoot higher frame rates is when you are using them to create slow motion by converting them down to 24 frames per second in post. Every video I've ever made with Devin Supertramp and on my own have all been shot at 24 frames per second, and any clips that you see in the videos that are slow motion were probably shot at 60 frames per second or higher. Essentially, the more frames you shoot, the slower you can slow everything down. So hopefully that gives you guys a better understanding of frame rates, the effect that each of those have on your video, and how to use them properly. If you guys have any further questions, let me know.